Good morning. Let me start by asking you a question this morning. Who's your hero? And don't give me a Sunday school answer. Don't put the name of someone that you know is watching or someone who's sitting next to you. Think of someone else, all right? Who would you say is currently a hero in your life? In 1898, there was a school teacher who polled over 1,400 children aged 12 to 14 to find out what sort of heroes the children had in their lives. And in that era, 90% of the children picked heroes from history. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln led the list, followed by Whittier, Clara Barton, Julius Caesar, Christopher Columbus. Very few of them gave first place to people who were living at the time. Well, somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, a professor at Massachusetts State Teachers College took a similar poll and marked a big change in the young people of our nation. At that time, only 33% picked their heroes from history. Franklin Roosevelt had passed Washington and Lincoln. Clara Barton still led among the girls. 37% identified their heroes from the living, among movie stars, sports figures, radio stars, comic book heroes. I wonder who will emerge as the heroes of our age. We could use some, couldn't we? And I don't mean like Iron Man or Hulk. I mean, we could use some real people whose names are going to stand out years from now because of what they did for their world and for those who would follow after them. We could use some heroes who will inspire the struggling people of this current time to become something more and to leave behind something better. I guess that's one thing I like about the life story of Daniel, is Daniel gives us a pattern of life to emulate. Better than Superman, better than Michael Jordan, better than any politician. A song was written by Philip P. Bliss in the late 1800s for his Sunday school class at a church in Chicago. It was written especially for children to consider the hero they could have in Daniel. And I remember learning it as a kid. The chorus went like this: dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. My dad seemed to think that Daniel was a worthwhile man to emulate. In fact, he thought that enough that he named my oldest brother after him, Daniel Lee Nichols. I am convinced that we ought to be generating more Daniel stories from the church. That followers of Jesus ought to be pushing forward more and more people like this man whose name is the stuff of legends that just happen to be true, and the hero stories that all of us could stand to stare at more often. This last message from the historical section of the book of Daniel is going to look at Daniel in that light. We're talking about the story that's most often associated with his name today, a story of courage, a den of lions, and the miracle that saved his life. We're in Daniel 6. Get your Bibles and turn there if you would. When we pick up in chapter 6, quite a bit of time has passed since the first chapter of Daniel. 539 BC, Cyrus the Great entered Babylon and appointed Darius as king of the region. He's the king we're reading about now. In other words, as Daniel has appeared throughout these stories, the Babylonian Empire that was under Nebuchadnezzar, later placed under Belshazzar, has fallen to the Medes and Persians. That means Daniel has been there now for 3 different kings during the reigns of 2 different nations. Daniel is still there. He's not a young man anymore, somewhere around 70. That by itself will shape what we can draw out from this story. Let's start reading in chapter 6, verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. It's a big kingdom. well organized. Cyrus the Great's kingdom was the largest kingdom geographically in the world to that point in history. He established, of all things, a postage route from Sardis to Susa, 1,700 miles long. And once again, you see, this is about real people of history who lived in real places that can be seen today. Here's a picture, for instance, of Cyrus's tomb in Iran. The Persian Empire was a powerful, well-established kingdom that remained intact until the time of Alexander the Great. It was Cyrus who allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And at the tip of the Medo-Persian organizational chart is our man, Daniel, one of 3 high officials, presidents, as one translation puts it. One of 3 over all the kingdom. So in verse 3, when it says that the king planned to set Daniel over the affairs of the whole kingdom, that is what we would call kind of a big deal. How did Daniel get to such a place? It wasn't by family advantage. Remember, Daniel was in exile. Daniel's family was long gone. He was a long way from home. He hadn't bought his way into his place. Daniel himself was a spoil of war. He came with nothing but the clothes he wore. The key, if you noticed it, is in verse 3. This Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. One of the features of a hero like Daniel that I want us to see today is that Daniel had an excellent spirit. Literally, it could be translated, a spirit that jutted out was in him. In Daniel's life, it was his spirit, not his flesh, that dominated. Just do a mental rehash about what we know about Daniel, and you can see how this description of him in his 70s fits what we know about him as a young man before. When he was young, Daniel determined not to defile himself with the king's food. Daniel was used by God to interpret the dreams of kings, and when he did it, he made it clear that it was God's power, not his own, that should be credited. Daniel kept his purity while he was away from his home and family, even though he was taken away from all he had previously known. We find Daniel in chapter 6 facing Jerusalem, praying to the one true God. Here are a couple observations. You put these shoes on and walk in them if they fit you, all right? Older people, Daniel is still useful. By the standards of his day, he is an old man, and he is still positioned to be put in charge of the organizational affairs of the largest kingdom of his day in history. He obviously still had something to offer. I have a feeling that the years cause some of our time-tested folks to feel like not doing what you used to do means you can't do much that matters. Not true. This week I received a phone call from more than one lady of our church family who's in her 80s. They called me. We received some cards, this couple of ladies in the church who are in that well-seasoned category. And I was reminded that there are people of them who are praying for me regularly. Folks, don't sell yourselves short. God has you hanging around for some reason, even though you may not be able to do as much as you did when you were 25. Here's another observation, and that is Christians should be the standouts. Obviously, Daniel was somebody who stood out in a culture that was embracing all the wrong things. And yet he managed to be somebody that God used to shape the course of world history in some ways. You may have noticed that our current culture, even locally, is embracing a lot of conflicting ideology these days. Let's be wise as we look at it. Let's apply truth to the situations around us. Consider what role God wants his people to have. What will make people stand out in the crowd now? Look at what Paul says in Philippians 2. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Brothers and sisters, if ever there was a time for those who follow Jesus to have excellent spirits and to shine as lights, it's now. We could use some heroes that way. Let's keep reading in Daniel chapter 6. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Here is another character quality that makes for a hero, and that is a sterling record. Verse 4 here in chapter 6 tells us that Daniel was faithful, that there was no error or fault to be found in him. Now imagine that. What does that mean? Daniel was a model worker. The king could count on Daniel to do his job. He was consistent in his work, wasn't sloppy or lazy about it. Remember, based on his value to this king, the king was of a mind to place Daniel over the whole kingdom. But don't just take the writer's word for it alone. Tune into the other TV channel. You know, the people who hate Daniel, who are jealous to the point where they want him dead. All right? They have some words to say about him too. What do you expect it to be? Here's what they say. There's no ground for complaint. We would just love to be able to sling some mud here, but there's no mud. There's no mud to sling. That must have been frustrating. Think about the book of Daniel. There is in that book a dream about an image that predicts the rise and fall of 5 kingdoms, hundreds of years into the future. There's the story of 3 young men thrown into a blazing fiery furnace and walking out not even smelling like smoke. There's the story of a king losing his mind until he is humble before God, and then God restores him to his kingdom. There is a disembodied hand writing a note on the wall about what's about to happen. Critics have tried to undermine the reliability of Daniel over the centuries. Archaeology has pretty well ruined their efforts. The critics just don't want to accept all the amazing stories of this book as true. I wonder how they feel about the story of a politician named Daniel who has been in his position for decades and who has a flawless record. Talk about an amazing story. By the way, it's not just that Daniel didn't get caught. There was nothing to catch. Nothing, that is, unless you can somehow fault him for keeping the law of God. Those words about Daniel have always challenged me. I want to be that kind of person. The kind that if I ran for office so that everyone who didn't want it to happen dug around all they could, the very worst that they could come up would be to say, he's a Christ follower. He believes that man from Galilee so long ago was actually God in the flesh visiting earth. He believes that Jesus died and rose from the dead. His life is full of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. He places the needs of others ahead of himself. He cares for the downcast. He acts like he's living for another world. Oh, for the world to use those kinds of insults against us. So, here's what the Daniel Defamation League does about it. Chapter 6, look at verse 6. Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors, the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. They got a law passed. They couldn't get Daniel on his character, so they got a law passed that would potentially get him in trouble. Under the circumstances, that gave Daniel two choices: continue to worship the one true God and face the consequences, or submit to the law and violate God's direct command. You know what Daniel chose. That's because he had a third quality of a hero, and that is stubborn devotion. One of the qualities of a true hero is that he wouldn't compromise what God had told him to do. Now, this is consistent with all that we know about Daniel, and it's part of what marks him as real hero material for us to admire and to copy today. Look at verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. There is something about the stories of people of faith who stick their necks out that should inspire us. When I was a boy in junior high, I read the story called Through Gates of Splendors, written by Elizabeth Elliot, about her husband and 4 other men who in the 50s were killed in Ecuador as they tried to take the message of Jesus to a remote indigenous tribe. I read the story of the Morse family, Exodus to Hidden Valley, the account of how they started the church among the Hmong people of Burma, and they fled for their lives across the jungle as communism swept into that area. I read about Brother Andrew, God's smuggler, sneaking Bibles into the Soviet Union. I've read the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German preacher who returned to Germany during the rise of Nazism because he knew the church needed a hero among them who would stand up for the truth and provide good direction. I read of Richard Wurmbrand, who was imprisoned for years and tortured in Romania by the communists, rather than stop preaching Jesus. The list of people like that is long, and it's being added to daily in our lives. There are people who have gotten it. They understand that following Jesus is supposed to be accompanied by a stubborn devotion that doesn't fold up when it's challenged. And we think we've been challenged because we've had to figure out how to have worship services in our homes. We might want to rethink that. This is much bigger than whether or not you get up on a Sunday morning, drive to a worship service, or even serve in the nursery or the children's wing. You see, those kinds of things are just a simple outward indicator of the inside devotion that points you to do them. We who are gathered here right now, aren't going to have to figure out if we're going to risk a lion's den next week. You know the end of Daniel's story. The king doesn't even want to have him executed, but he had signed an irrevocable law. So Daniel is thrown into some kind of cave or cavern where lions are kept for the purpose, apparently, of destroying people. Chapter 6, verse 18. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at break of day the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. They have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad, and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they were threatened with death, and they said, "Our God is able to deliver us, but if not." we don't have Daniel saying that, but what we do have is another follower of the one true God standing his ground no matter what the cost. And this story's purpose clearly isn't just to teach us that God will deliver everyone who believes in him from death. Or is it? You see, in Daniel's case, he was delivered from death by lions. But Daniel still died at some point. I don't know for sure how, but I'm pretty sure he'd be very old if he was still alive today. Daniel and every one of us needs more than just to be rescued from physically dying. The scriptures say it's appointed unto man once to die, and after this comes judgment. That's how it works. We have a tendency to be pretty short-sighted in this life. Medicine works that way. We might spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and endure difficult surgeries and treatments, all in the name of adding a few more years to life here. And after that comes judgment. The thing from which we really need to be saved is the death of our souls in hell. The thing we really need to be sure of is that we'll be delivered from eternity away from God. And the good news this morning is that is the one thing I can be sure of. I'm not sure how I'm going to die. I can't tell you when that will be. I may not have any say in that, but of this I am sure. Jesus Christ laid down his life for me. I have a righteousness from God that comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. Our greatest opposition to life was defanged when Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead on the third day. When it all came down to it, Daniel's greatest achievement was that he trusted in God for his greatest need. And I expect to meet him in heaven one day, not because of his heroic qualities, but because of his humble faith in God. I'd like to know for sure that you'll be there too. Whoever you are watching this morning, joining us here, you can be sure of your salvation. You can be sure that your life in heaven is secured, that your name is in the Lamb's book of life. That happens beginning through faith in Jesus Christ. It might be this morning that you're interested in how to have a relationship with Jesus. You've been thinking about that, or today shows maybe that you're here, that you are thinking about it. We would really like the chance to talk to you about how to become a follower of Christ, how to be delivered from the greatest threat of death that all of us face. Would you please today establish some kind of a line of communication with us? We're putting prompts on the screen. We're inviting you to email, to call, to contact us through our website. Please don't let this day slip by without making sure of your greatest need that only Jesus Christ can meet. God bless you. Thanks for being here today.